Hi everybody, welcome to Talking Automotive with Mark and John. My name's Ky Sinclair and my co-host Mark Palavestra.
Hi John, great to be back again. We've got some fantastic speakers today from South Africa, some very serious heavy hitters in the industry, some amazing information.
Yeah Mark, I think some very senior guys, Jessup and Johan Kleynhans. Great guys, they've got tremendous industry experience, been in the business a long time. And the great thing is they know how to get going and get things done. So I think it's going to be a really interesting discussion today talking to them. Let's jump into the conversation. So John, Johan, it's a great honor for us to have you on our show today. Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you, Mark, and my colleague, John Jessup. It's nice in this time where everything is locked down to at least still have some contact with the outside world.
Yeah, I think when I look at your history, you've got such in-depth experience across the automotive industry. John, you started with BMW as marketing manager. You moved across to Nissan. I think you were there nearly 18 years, and you had huge achievements. You were the sales and marketing director and looked after network. I think for quite a long time, you were number 2 brand in South Africa for Nissan. You achieved market shares, I think were probably some of the highest outside Japan, nearly up to 18-19%. So it was a huge achievement. You also were CEO for Geely for a couple of years, and then you were director of sales and marketing for Beijing Auto Works. And then now you've got into your own business as managing partner for automotive marketing and franchising assignments. So tremendous amount of knowledge. So we're really looking forward to talking to you today about the automotive industry and the impacts of what's happening with COVID across South Africa. And Johan, you also have a very similar background. Also started with BMW. You came across to Nissan, where I think you're also close to 18 years with Nissan. Is that correct, Johan?
Yeah, a little bit longer. I was there for 20 years. So I have roughly 40 years experience, 20 at Nissan, 5 as an independent consultant, and 4 as an independent consultant, and 6 at BMW, or 14 at BMW.
Yeah. And I think for 6 years, you're the sales, marketing, and after-sales director for Nissan. So a fantastic amount of achievement there. And now you're also working with Johan in the same business as a managing partner. So welcome. We look forward to speaking to you today.
Now, gentlemen, I'm keen to get an understanding of the South African market. So both of you are very knowledgeable re the South African marketplace. And we're keen to get, if you could provide our listeners with some background as to what the composition of the South African market is, who are the main players and which manufacturers actually build vehicles there, and what are the key challenges in the market?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Mark. South Africa, like I guess most markets, the motor industry is very competitive. We have most of the global car manufacturers represented in South Africa. We have 7 at the moment vehicle manufacturers, so we still have quite a healthy manufacturing base in South Africa. We have Toyota, Volkswagen, Ford, Nissan, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz, together with Isuzu as the 7 major manufacturers in South Africa. More recently, Mahindra also entered that market, and they're assembling some pickup vehicles in Durban, in South Africa. Now, Isuzu used to be, as you know, part of the global General Motors tie-up, and of course, when General Motors left South Africa, like they're in the process of doing now in your country, last year, Isuzu took over the production facilities, and they continued to assemble Isuzu vehicles in South Africa. So 7 manufacturers, major manufacturers, with one smaller one being Mahindra. Just looking at the NAAMSA sales figures, there's 37 manufacturers that report their sales to NAAMSA, and there's probably I don't know exactly how big the number is of non-reporters. So just about everybody is represented in South Africa. And it's very easy to enter the South African market. The cost of entry is very low. And most manufacturers, obviously, would be represented in South Africa. And it's very easy to get into the market. Very simply, all you need to do with your vehicles is to be homologated, normally EMARC or European approved, and you can sell your vehicles in South Africa. So cost of entry is very, very low. And it's a fairly big market. It's, I think, on average, 550,000 units. Obviously, it's had peaks and it's been lower than that. But let's call it 550,000 TIV, which makes it, I guess, one of the top 25 markets in the world. So therefore, quite attractive for manufacturers to invest or to enter the market.
Okay, when you say there's no barriers to entry, can manufacturers sell left-hand drive cars there, or do they have to be all right-hand drive?
Yeah, of course, that's why I mentioned homologation. So provided that your vehicle is homologated, it's normally using European as a base. And of course, there's requirements like that. So it's got to be a right-hand drive vehicle. So there's basic requirements. But once your vehicle is homologated, nothing stops you from entering the market. And you can start selling. You set up your distribution network and off you go. So it's been very attractive. And we've seen many manufacturers that has entered the South African market, and in particularly from the east, like Chinese, many of them have entered. My guess is that there's probably more than 15 or so Chinese manufacturers that has put their toe in the water in the South African market, but has subsequently left. So there is the reason for that is, as I said, the low cost of entry into the market.
And as far as exports, do the local manufacturers export out of South Africa?
Yeah, there's a government incentive program known as the Automotive Incentive Scheme. There's been many, and John, you'll recall some of those in your time in South Africa. So the latest one is the as I've mentioned. And of course, this encourages production. And the reason for that is to facilitate and to improve or to get higher levels of employment. So by increasing the production, of course, they can employ more people, and that's good for the economy. As the South African motor industry probably contributes about 7 or 8% to the country's GDP. So it's fairly significant. And of course, it's a fairly large employer. So to give you an indication, the large exporters is generally the German manufacturers, Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, and BMW. But more recently, Toyota and Ford has also entered that market in exports in terms of being some of the large players. So in total exports, I think last year was almost 400,000 units. So it's significant. It's becoming a significant number. If you look at the total manufacturing was around 630,000 with exports of around 400,000.
And as a sales and marketing company, what are the challenges in the South African market? What are the biggest challenges to overcome?
Yeah, I think it's no different to what it is in the rest of the world. I guess some of the issues that we've got maybe that other markets don't have is that, as I said, we've exported almost 400,000 units, but our total market is 500,000. So that means there's still a large number of vehicles that has to be imported. So that means that you have a lot of competition, lots of models competing. Some of the segments are very, very crowded. And then, of course, you've got certain logistical issues. Being done of Africa, it's not always easy to get either CKD to a plant in South Africa and then get the exported vehicle back to a major market like Europe or North America, or similarly to get a completely built-up unit from either Japan or Europe into South Africa. So distribution, that type of thing, makes it fairly complex. And then, of course, we have, like I guess most markets, particularly your market, we've got some major centers like the major metro areas, but we also have a fairly large rural area. And we have lots of dealers in these rural areas. So it puts a lot of pressure on these smaller dealers in rural areas where they've got a relatively small market for them, obviously, to continue and to survive in a very competitive environment.
And as far as the main vehicle, what would be the main market segment? Is it medium SUV? Is it large vehicle, small car, passenger? Is it medium pickup and cab chassis? Where's the market, the main sweet spot for vehicles?
Okay, if we can maybe spend a bit of time on that. South Africa obviously is commercial vehicles is very, very prominent. Commercial vehicles probably makes up about 40% of all vehicle sales. We refer often to commercial vehicles as a bakkie, or in your case, a pickup. So that's predominantly a one-ton pickup, which comes in the same type of configuration that you would get in your market. So single cab, double cab, 4x4, 4x2, etc. And these vehicles are obviously used then predominantly as delivery vehicles, or in the farming community, where farmers use these vehicles to obviously be able to facilitate the type of work that they do in their market. So that's a fairly significant part of the segment. Probably the second most significant part of the segment is SUV, and round about the C segment. So just about everybody is represented in that particular segment. Everybody is playing in that segment. And then, of course, we also have small vehicles, which is very important in our market. Small vehicles because of affordability. I think we were one of the first markets in the world that introduced Datsun, which I believe is now going to be discontinued globally anyway. But again, it illustrates the importance of a small or an affordable vehicle. So all the manufacturers that have got small vehicles, whether it's the Koreans or the Indians or whatever, they would have launched small vehicles in this market. And then, of course, on the other end of the scale, it's not only politicians here that drive BMW and Mercedes vehicles, but they also luxury vehicles still remains a fairly important part of the segment. So I think that gives you a bit of an overview of the market. I think maybe just to continue on a bit of representation, we have about 1,600 franchise dealers. They employ probably about 50, 60,000 people, and that makes up the backbone of obviously the retail industry in our market. We also have a very active used car market, which is either linked to the franchise dealer or maybe independent. We've got the guys that sell the cheaper vehicles, and we've got the guys that sell the more expensive vehicles or vehicles that is controlled in terms of manufacturers' programs. It's like any approval program that the manufacturer might have, meeting certain criteria in terms of age, mileage, and that sort of thing. And a dealer typically would look exactly like your dealer. They trade in new vehicles, they trade in used vehicles, they obviously have a service department, very active parts department, F&I and so on. So not too dissimilar from your market in that sense, which in fact is a little bit unique in Africa, because most of the other markets in Africa, you cannot trade a vehicle in. The dealer won't trade in your used car. So a sales company or a dealer or a distributor in a market like Kenya, for example, will only be selling the new car. There's very little other business around used cars, for example. So that hopefully gives you some sort of an overview on the market and the type of thing that is happening in our market.
Right, thank you. Now, just one last quick one. Given there's so much manufacturing, because I'm actually staggered, that's a very impressive number for manufacturing. Are there incentives, government incentives for the manufacturers, and do they get offsets for imports? So a local manufacturer, is there an incentive for them to bring in CKD or CBU units in from their other global markets and give them a competitive advantage versus a 100% importer?
So very briefly, the way that it works is that the current program that the government is running is an incentive. It's based on production. So, of course, the intention is to increase the production as much as possible. The higher the production, of course, the higher the level of employment. So the incentives is linked to a production performance. Of course, CBUs coming in would be taxed accordingly, like in any other market. So CKD coming in for your manufacturing of the local produced vehicle, which would then be re-exported or could be sold locally. Of course, there would be some tax advantages there, provided that you meet certain production performance targets to make sure that we can employ more people. So that's in essence is the incentive program. So it's aimed at increasing production and therefore increasing employment.
if I might come in and just add one point there, the people that manufacture locally have another advantage in terms of generating what are called export credits. So these credits can be sold into the open market or can be utilized by that manufacturer to offset the duties of their CBUs. So there's a definite advantage to being a local manufacturer with a vibrant export program. And I think that is going to be where the future is. I think the independent importers, Johan touched on them earlier, are going to find it increasingly more difficult, particularly as our currency weakens, to be able to compete against the established manufacturers. Some of them are surviving through subsidizing and cross-subsidizing their imports here with other markets, or sourcing them from Eastern Europe or India or Indonesia. But I can't see that lasting as long as the South African rand in the last few months has moved from somewhere around about 15 to the dollar, started testing the 20 to the dollar exchange rate. So you can imagine the pressure that the independent importers are under and are going to continue to be under.
Thanks, John. Yeah, because we actually jumped ahead to one of the questions I was going to ask is how often does the rand fluctuate? Because we find in the Australian market, the Australian dollar is, the market is so sensitive to movements 1 or 2 cents. So that kind of movement in rand, do you see that as being a major disruption for your market?
Yeah, I think if we look at the developing countries around, or so-called developing countries around the world, the South African currency is the most highly traded, and it's a completely free market. There's very little intervention by the central bank or anybody else, so it fluctuates daily. And of course, our wonderful government bonds now have junk status by all the major credit rating agencies, and that was the latest shock that hit us, predominantly on the back of excessive government debt. So yes, the currency is extremely volatile, but unfortunately in the wrong direction in the last few months.
Thank you.
I think that's an important point. You can imagine what is going to happen to new vehicle pricing when the business opens. In fact, John asked earlier about our lockdown status. So retail dealers started opening up about 2 weeks ago and getting ready to start selling, but with lots of limitations, etc. But you can imagine the impact of the rand-dollar exchange rate from 15 to the dollar to almost 20 to the dollar. What that will impact on vehicle pricing, especially on CBUs. Interesting is that maybe unlike other markets, our manufacturing base here, we've got a fairly active supply base. So there's a lot of local content that goes into South African produced vehicles. So it's not a kit that is imported and just assembled here. So yes, you can offset some of the local component pricing, which is not affected by the exchange rate. So that will have another advantage on the locally produced car, for example, vis-a-vis a fully imported CBU.
That's an excellent point, Johan. I think the ideal situation is to be exchange rate neutral. In other words, you're exporting as much as you're importing. And I think in the last couple of years, in fact, it's been, for the local manufacturers, it's been exchange rate positive. In other words, they've been generating more out of exports than what they've been importing, and then just selling the excess credits to the independent importers. So that is it's actually an excellent plan, and it's worked extremely well for our economy and for our industrial sector in South Africa. We can just hope that it carries on in that direction, and there's not too much political interference to get involved with the success that's generated so far.
Because it's the base of Africa, so there's a lot of export into Africa, both components and vehicles. Can you just fill us in what sort of role South Africa plays?
Oh, sure, John. There's two ways of looking at this. I think the first one is, as Johan implied, the industry here is very big. Africa is very much still a developing continent, and traditionally, I would say the South African market has been around about 50% of the total African market. And in terms of sub-Sahara, maybe more than 80%. So there are a large number of countries, and the markets there are extremely fragmented, protected, controlled, very difficult to operate in. A lot of parent companies have seen South Africa as a base to export into Africa because of the geographical proximity, certain trade associations with like SADC, which is an association of Southern African countries which get preferential duties. But it's actually extremely difficult to export any kind of volume into those countries. The LCV market that Johan spoke about, that is so prevalent within South Africa, is also the case in Sub-Sahara. So we've seen manufacturers like Toyota, Nissan, Isuzu exporting relatively small quantities to Sub-Sahara. The big export opportunities are really back to the parent company markets. For example, if you want to do the kind of numbers that Johan was talking about, you need to be exporting vehicles in the thousands per month rather than odds and ends to fragmented markets in sub-Sahara Africa. So I would the model that's developing is that you would get a particular model that is developed by the source company for manufacture only in South Africa. Ford has developed a very nice LCV range called the Ranger, which is unique to South Africa and covers all the little subsegments and niches and gets re-exported to the other big Ford markets elsewhere in the world. BMW, for example, the X3 BMW, South Africa is the only place in the world where that model is now produced. So it makes sense because you're focusing logistically and in terms of training your employees in the plant, your processes, those sort of things into one particular model range. But you've really got to be jacked up because a model like BMW, for example, there are millions of options that can be ordered by people around the world, and your factory needs to be geared up for that, which is the complete antithesis to CKD, the old CKD methodology. So people have moved to much more flexible logistics and providing the options that the rest of the world requires. Plants like Toyota are doing the Corolla back to Europe, and certainly Mercedes-Benz are doing big volumes of the C-Class back to America. So that is tending to be the model to generate the kind of export models that are needed. But yes, we do have a presence in Sub-Sahara. We have created a capability of operating in those markets, but it's very difficult. It's going to take time.
John, we spoke about your success at Nissan for such a long period, and Australia is a very competitive market. I think we have about 64 brands competing in Australia. We don't have any manufacturing, but it's a very aggressive market. What are the 2 or 3 points that you think created your success with Nissan and that could be applied to the Australian market or OEM trying to gain market share in the Australian market?
Wow, that's a great question. I think when Johan and I joined Automakers, as it was known at that time, it was a fully owned, South African-owned company, which had its advantages and its disadvantages. The advantage was that we had a lot more freedom to do stuff that we couldn't get from Japan at the right price. The disadvantage, of course, was that you're not at the top of the priority list for the development of new products. But I think when we got there, the first point is that I think the top management, iconic guys like John Newbery, Stephanus Loebscher, and also the Sanlam management, which was our main shareholder, was really very good, and they knew what they wanted. In the field of marketing, the people that were in the team when we joined, they were excellent people and very well qualified in terms of their field, but they didn't always understand what the top management wanted or how to implement what the top management required. I think that was something that we were able to bring to the party. We spoke the same language, and we understood what was required and how to implement it. At BMW, some people say to me, gee, didn't you find it much more difficult moving to Nissan from BMW? Yeah, look, in some respects, that was the case. But, at the top end at BMW, you sold them one at a time. And suddenly you joined a company that was selling, getting in orders for 50, 100, 200 at a time. And in some respects, that was a lot easier. Another reason for our success, and I think Johan must take the credit for this, because I brought him in as general manager of the Fiat product. And as an independent company, motor company in South Africa, we couldn't get entry-level product from Nissan to get that small car market going. And that small car market was actually quite a tough market, believe it or not, because South Africa was actually a large car market. They saw small as being less quality, less safety. But they had, in the meantime, done a deal with Fiat on the Uno to manufacture it locally under license and to market it. And we got stuck into that one pretty quickly. And Johan took the volume there. I think we were doing 700 a month, Johan. They were doing 600, 700. I think 1 month we hit 1,200, 1,500 a month, just from knowing how to make the market aware that small is not necessarily worse and less. We pushed the safety features, we pushed the convenience factors, the economy, and we found that the Uno took off. In fact, we were the first local manufacturer to get the small car market going. I think the other reason is that there was some nice new product. The Sentra range at that time was not more than a year old, and that was a great range of products. That was anyway doing well. So that just needed a bit of a nudge and a bit of direction in terms of brand identity vis-a-vis Corolla, which was the major competitor. The LCV market, wow. I remember Stephanus Loebscher saying to me during one of my interviews, he used the words, and certainly that was the case at that time. He said, in the LCV market, you can get away with murder. And as long as you had a reliable vehicle and you were reading the market correctly, that it was going much more into dual usage, the more luxury features you could put into the vehicles, the better. We had the freedom to package the products with special editions from time to time. Also at that time, believe it or not, one could not get SUVs at a reasonable price from overseas. So they'd opened a company called Sani in Pietermaritzburg, fantastic little company, modifying single cab LCVs, workhorse LCVs, into double cabs and SUVs. So that was something else that needed to be marketed properly. And I was, for my sins, made a director of that company. And it was great because my family was living down there at that time. So I always had a 4x4 when I was down on holiday. But that was another reason for our success. And we just knew, I think the right things had been put in place, but they needed people that knew how to implement what was required. And that was what I think we were able to bring to the party. I don't know if Johan would like to add something to that.
I think, John, that covers it pretty accurately. I think the significance of the insight of the management of the company at the time to have products like the Fiat Uno and to create products like the Sani double cab and SUV, I think was significant in terms of the overall success of the company at the time. And as John said, all that needed to be done was to make sure that the right programs existed to launch and support these vehicles into the market.
So my understanding from what you said is getting a full understanding of what your customers want and require, and then making sure that happens, and then everything else just falls into place. Is that correct, John?
I think that, as Johan so nicely summed up, I think the management had put a lot of things in place. They had already identified what the customers could require or would require in the near future. It was a question of being able to connect with those customers and being able to communicate with them the benefits of those products and why they should consider them. It was really the marketing expertise, the public relations expertise that wasn't there to be able to communicate what these products could offer and how we could get them to connect with the customer. So what the customers wanted had already been identified. It was just a question of connecting better with them.
And what medium did you use? What media? Was it PR? Was it TV? What was the marketing? What was the messaging plan to do that?
When I joined as marketing director, I brought Johan in about 9 months to a year later. I couldn't believe the size of the budget that I had compared with BMW for marketing. And this budget was huge. And marketing in those days was a lot different to what it is today. And I, quite frankly, didn't really know what to do with all this money. I was just told that, listen, we've got 5 major product lines. I want to see a TV ad on each one of these product lines at any point in time. And I want the TV ads to be refreshed all the time. So the ad agency that had been appointed, we knew some of the owners. They were previously directors of the BMW ad agency in the early days. And only one of the major partners was allowed on the Nissan premises. The relationship was so poor between the top management and the ad agency that only one individual from the ad agency was allowed into our building. So I said, whoa, hang on, there's a problem here. So we had to fix that. I tried very hard with them and we did some good stuff. But after 2 years or so, I had to change them. And funny enough, the ad agency that I'd appointed at BMW was part of TBWA. And TBWA were the worldwide Nissan advertising people. So I went back to them and I said, hey, let's talk. So they created a separate company for us, and we did some great work. There was also quite a good CRM program in place, very basic in those days. There was a magazine that went to all the customers, except that they didn't have the right names and addresses for everybody. So we used to get these piles of boxes coming into the building of returns from the post office of these expensive glossy magazines. Customer care programs and publicizing them properly. We went into the market with a set of promises. If we don't fix your car first time, we'll fix it for free, things like that. And that was quite revolutionary at that time. But certainly in terms of advertising, you had, if you went onto the TV news at prime time and you got into the early slot, everybody watched the news in those days. And they alternated between English and Afrikaans. And you just put your TV into that slot, and there were 2 Sunday newspapers. And if you went into print, you went into those newspapers, and everybody knew what you wanted to tell them. So we took the risk of some wastage, but I think that rather than fragmenting our message over 50 magazines, the focus, I think, worked very well for us, together with the content. On the PR side, I think it was just a question of, there was quite a good relationship with the media, although it was more of a social relationship, and it needed to be turned into a business relationship. And then when Johan moved up as a director of corporate communications, that changed a lot in terms of what wasn't being done before. And again, I think, Johan, you might want to comment on that particularly interesting part of our transition to Nissan.
Yeah, thank you, John. So I think he summed it up very nicely when you said that it was a social relationship as opposed to a working or a business relationship. So even in those days, there were only 7 was taxed to the roof. So of course, it tried to protect the local industry. But despite that, it was nevertheless very competitive. And my view was very simple: is that car magazine, or any magazine for that matter, was going to be published. It was going to be published, and it was going to consist of 150 pages or 160 pages, whatever. So our role was to make sure that we can get onto as many of those 160 pages as possible. Of course, we could do nothing, and we won't be in car magazine at all. Or if we had a particular strategy and a particular approach, we would make sure that we get our fair share of column centimeter in the magazine, the newspaper, or for that matter on television or any electronic media, radio stations or whatever else it was. And it was just basically focusing on those things, but clearly following the direction that has been set by the overall strategy for a particular product or a particular model or a particular model range.
All right. Now, gentlemen, a question for me. South Africa's been in lockdown. You mentioned before that the haircut situation, we're a bit different. We've been able to get some haircuts and sneak out, etc. Now, South Africa's been in complete lockdown. Will start to come out during June. Now, this is going to have this lockdown has had a massive or significant impact on the new car market. Have there been any learnings from the GFC and the actions that happened post that you can see coming into play this time? Or do you think this is different and the actions need to be different to the GFC actions? So I suppose just get the understanding of what happened after GFC, and then do you see this as being different, or do those actions still stand the test of time to be implemented now?
I think the situation is different in the sense that the lockdown this time round is a lot more severe, and the impact will certainly be felt for a lot longer than what was the time of the global financial crisis. So I think that's the first point that one must realize. Maybe going into some of the specifics, John, let's hand over to you. You can start off with, and I'll fill in as we go along.
Okay. I think let's start by saying that we were not, as a country, as badly hit as other countries by the GFC, because our authorities at that time saw that things had become overheated, and they'd pushed up interest rates well into double digits before the crunch came. I remember at that time, our pension plan, which was of great interest to me as I was getting closer to the time, became a flexible one where we could move into 4 different categories of risk. And I just moved everything into the money market, maybe a bit almost at the right time. And I was getting 12% interest on my investment in my pension fund.
Wow!
So yeah, the whole environment was to some extent already under quite a tight monetary discipline. But when it hit, our local banks completely and unnecessarily, in my opinion, and that of most of my colleagues in the industry, completely overreacted and just shut down shop. Now, that wasn't unique to the rest of the world, but it should have been unique because they had been protected much more than their colleagues overseas. Unless your credit was watertight, you couldn't get a thing approved. Now, each major OEM in South Africa has a joint venture with the banks, and this has been the model for a long time. And the first thing that we did together with our dealer networks and our dealer councils was to put pressure under our partner banks and to find ways of making them more comfortable by giving them better customer referrals, for example, by working a lot more closely with them and getting involved with what we call dealer risk management from the floor plan side. And there were, yes, that was done before, but we got into micromanaging dealers that we'd identified as risk dealers and made sure that our banks knew about this. In fact, during that period, we only lost one dealer, but it was a major dealer, and that was more through his fault than anything which we did or didn't do. So those were the kind of actions that we took. I think, getting on to the next question in our list, the must-do actions. We had a whole bunch of dealer activities in place already. During the good times, what we should maybe point out to you is that the upturn before the GFC was a long upturn by South African standards, right from the early 2000s all the way through to 2007. The iconic Ronnie Watson, who was heading Westbank, which is the biggest motor bank in South Africa, was predicting that the South African market would grow to 1 million units by 2010. And it was a bit sad in a way because he had an unblemished record up until that time. And of course, when the crunch came, everybody was very happy to tell him that he was wrong, which he was, because the market collapsed back to 300,000 or 400,000 for a few years, but started growing again. So a lot of we took advantage of those good times. In fact, at one stage, our factory couldn't supply enough vehicles to what the market wanted. The lesson we learned from that is, if you're going to go to a new computer system, and we were instructed to put the SAP system into our company, and it's a great system, but you need to put it in properly. Don't do it while market is good. Just stick to your old systems so that you can make sure that you don't get any disruptions to supply, which we got. And in fact, our dealers, and this is quite a serious point, our dealers even wanted to take us to court at the time because we could not supply what they required. But the point I'm making is that we took advantage during that time. We had an MD, Mexican chap, Julio Panama. Johan and I got on very well with him because I think we understood him and he understood us. And we started getting stuck into CSI. For example, he said, "You're number 8 on CSI. We would like to be number 1 in the next 2 years," which we achieved on both sales and service. So we put a lot of actions in place already. But during, obviously, when the crisis hit, we intensified a lot of that activity. The CSI program, we put in a variable margin program, or we had put in a variable margin program. We tightened it up in terms of making it more attractive for dealers to hit their numbers and earn their quarterly bonus. It was also linked to standards achievement. So we had a lot of those sort of things. Structured dealer performance management we had in place. Dealer financial management. Best practice sharing was a top focus, assisted by the dealer council. So we really just intensified a whole bunch of stuff that was already in place.